Friends, today we come to explore the book of Numbers, perhaps even to wrestle with it. The book of Numbers is the fourth book of the Bible, and it tells the story of the 40 years of wandering in the desert. And so it continues the story on from the end of the book of Exodus, with the book of Leviticus being a sort of interlude in between the two books. The book of Numbers begins with the numbering of the people of Israel in a census, hence the title Numbers. The Jewish name for the book is Into the Desert, and it more accurately describes the content of the book, which tells of the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness before the Israelites finally enter the promised land. In those wanderings, God leads them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. I think there are many who would long for God to lead them in that way today. In the central section of the book, we read of the Israelites' challenges and struggles and rebellions, not just against Moses, but also against God. The first major rebellion comes early on, when scouts are sent into the promised land and all but two of them say that it is too dangerous to enter. In God's wrath at their lack of courage and faith, he condemns them to 40 years of wandering before the next opportunity to enter the promised land, and that none of the first generation, including Moses, would be able to enter the promised land, but only those of the second generation would be able to do so. And that's where the book ends, with another numbering or census of the people, as the second generation from the Exodus now finally prepare to enter the promised land. Again, we are left with a number of questions. How historical is the book? Did it all happen just as it is written? Or is the purpose of the book perhaps more than just a factual history of the events in the past? Now, clearly there are many Christians around the world who would indeed read Numbers as literal history. But again, there are some challenges to reading it in this way. And the first major challenge is the numbers of the people that are recorded in the book. As with the book of Exodus, the number of fighting men in the book is recorded at 600,000, or close thereabouts, which suggests that at a minimum there were at least around 2 million Israelites wandering around the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. Now, when compared to population levels of other parts of the Middle East at that time, there are many who would suggest that these numbers are almost certainly an exaggeration. Logistically speaking, it would also be a little bit like the whole population of Northern Ireland, wandering around the island of Ireland for 40 years. In fact, the Sinai Peninsula is only about 2/3 the size of the island of Ireland. Secondly, one is left wondering what kind of a God it is, who in chapter 15 orders someone who has been found gathering firewood on the Sabbath to be stoned to death. It sounds a bit like something from the Taliban in Afghanistan. It's an act of terrible brutality, not just condoned by what I would call the God character in the book, but in fact instructed by God. If God gave such instructions to the Israelites in the past, how could we be sure that it is not God sanctioning the actions of the Taliban the next time they order a lawbreaker to be stoned to death? If we condemn such acts of brutality today, why do many Christians today not question such acts of brutality in the Bible? As I said last week in the reflection on Leviticus, it is quite inconceivable to me to believe that the God revealed by Jesus would ever order anyone at any time to be put to death in such a violent and barbaric way. If, as Paul writes in Colossians, that Jesus is the visible image of the invisible God, then this story is perhaps for me the first sign that not everything contained within the book of Numbers is literal history. This raises wider questions also about the nature of God portrayed in the book. The image of God in the book comes across often as quite an uppity and cantankerous person who is quick to lose patience and quick to strike out in anger, and ready to walk out on his relationship with the Israelites. On a number of occasions, Moses is portrayed as having to plead and intercede on behalf of the people of Israel, that God should not abandon them or punish them too harshly, almost like a family member trying to plead with a husband or a father who has lost patience with his wife and children and is now ready to walk out on them. But in the New Testament, we read that God is love, and in 1 Corinthians 13, Paul describes what love is like, that love is patient and kind. It is not easily angered. In other words, there is a maturity about love that acts with wisdom and with consideration, and that doesn't just throw its toys out the cot when things don't go its way. Again, if the New Testament, if in the New Testament Jesus says, "If you have seen me, or you have seen the Father," then either God has changed and matured over the years, or the descriptions of God given in the book of Numbers are not necessarily always accurate reflections of the true nature of God as made known by Jesus. And so for me, when I read the book of Numbers, I don't read it as factual history that is necessarily correct in all its details. From my perspective, the book of Numbers firstly represents an ancient and often primitive people reflecting back over their past and asking the question, how did we make it through that period in our history? And in response to that question, they told stories, and I would say many centuries later, about quails in the desert, pillars of cloud and fire, and water coming from a rock, to communicate their conviction that if it were not for God's providential hand, they would never have survived as a people. This is, I think, a fairly common human experience. Many of us have experiences of looking back and wondering, how did I get through that time in my life? Often with a deep sense that somehow, if it were not for a greater guiding and sustaining presence in our lives, sometimes with inexplicable coincidences that happened on the way, we couldn't have made it through alone. Apart from this, I think the purpose of the book of Numbers also, I believe, was intended to be for the Jewish descendants of the ancient Israelites a kind of extended parable, meant to communicate certain moral or archetypal lessons to them, rather than simply to be a record of literal history. Now, what might some of these moral or kind of archetypal lessons might be? What might some of them be that are still relevant for us today? Firstly, the book suggests that living with a constant rebellious spirit and a lack of courage in life can delay the attainment of our greater goals. According to the story, soon after leaving Mount Sinai, the Israelites are given their first opportunity to enter the promised land. Their courage fails. They don't have faith that God will be with them. They rebel against Moses and attempt to replace him with a new leader who will lead them back to Egypt. The long and short of it is that they are condemned to wandering the desert for another 40 years, which is the ancient Hebrew way of saying that they ended up wandering in the desert a whole lot longer than perhaps they should have. And so their progress is hindered by their rebellious and uncooperative spirit. I wonder how often that might be true of us also. How often do we become stumbling blocks to our own progress in life? Secondly, I believe it suggests that sometimes we can look back to the past with rose-colored glasses. In the story, the people grumble and complain, and they long to go back to what they remember as the comfort and security of Egypt, when in actual fact it had been a place of abuse and oppression. Do we live with rose-colored glasses, trying to escape back to an idealized past, or do we seek to live with courage and determination in the reality of the present, the only moment in which we can truly live? Thirdly, I wonder if there's a lesson that suggests that failing to make time for rest will bring on an early death. If we go back to that barbaric and brutal story in chapter 15, when the God character in the story condemns a man to death by stoning when he is found gathering firewood on the Sabbath, and if we begin to read it perhaps symbolically and metaphorically rather than literally, is it possible that this story might become for us a kind of a parable that suggests that life without proper rest brings a kind of a death in our lives? Many people today who work long hours without a day off or a proper weekend face huge stress and health risks. In some ways, it is perhaps the danger and even the downside of what is sometimes referred to as the Protestant work ethic. If it becomes too much of a badge of honor that we wear too proudly and is not balanced by rest, it begins to bear its own destructive consequences in our lives. And that brings us to a fourth lesson, that our actions in life have consequences. And for me, that is what these stories about God's wrath and punishment were seeking to communicate. In life, all of our actions have consequences. And part of our growth to becoming whole and responsible human beings is to consider the consequences of our actions. I personally don't believe in a God who condones the mass killing of women and boys as an act of war, or keeping perhaps 32,000 virgins as plunder after one's enemies have been defeated, as we read in Numbers 31. Neither do I believe in a God who literally sends a plague of venomous snakes to punish and kill the people, as we read in Numbers 21. But I do believe that, metaphorically speaking, we can often feel afflicted by what may feel like metaphorical fiery snakes, which are the consequences of our actions that have come back to bite us. And that if we wish to be healed from our suffering, it needs to become an object of our contemplation, like looking upon that bronze snake which Moses lifted up on a pole, and as the people looked upon it, they were healed. In other words, we need to take time to ponder and look deeply into the causes of our suffering before we can be healed from it. In closing, for many Christians, from the earliest time, this image of the bronze snake being lifted up on a pole by Moses has been used as an early metaphor to interpret the death of Jesus, as we would find in John chapter 3, suggesting that Jesus' crucifixion is like that bronze serpent that has been lifted up in the desert, and that somehow inexplicably the death of Jesus has the ability to bring healing and life to those who take the time to look upon it deeply and to meditate upon it. When we take the time to reflect deeply on Christ's act of selfless and sacrificial love, it has the power to transform and to break open the hardness of our hearts, as we often sing, "Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all." And so these are a few thoughts on the book of Numbers. They're certainly not a final word on the book. They're really just my own reflections as I've wrestled with the book, seeking to make sense of it in the light of my own faith, as one seeking to be a follower of Jesus. So may God bless you as you wrestle with the book, and perhaps you might find other interpreters who might also bring other rich interpretations of its potential meaning and relevance for us today. God bless you. Amen.